The nonprofit Human Rights Watch says Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is recruiting children as young as 12 for roles linked to the conflict. The group says the campaign allows minors to sign up for activities ranging from support work to checkpoint duties and patrols. This comes as Iran faces sustained airstrikes from the United States and Israel. Rights groups warn that placing children at or near military sites could expose them to serious risk of injury or death. Human Rights Watch says the recruitment of children under 15 can constitute a war crime under international law. And I can now talk about all of this with Bill Van Esveld. He's the Associate Director of the Children's Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. Bill, welcome to the day. Tell us about the IRGC's recruitment of children and how widespread it is.
Thanks very much for focusing on this really disturbing issue. The recruitment campaign started being publicized by the IRGC just recently. We saw reports about it on the 26th of last month. I should note that there have been reports of children manning checkpoints even previous to that recruitment drive coming out. The recruitment drive focused on Greater Tehran specifically, and said that children would be, invited and encouraged to do security-related duties as well as other activities, but all activities involving support to military groups, and therefore placing those kids at risk of being hit during attacks by the U.S. and Israel.
At what point does this become a war crime under international law?
Well, international law is very clear that no child under the age of 18 should be recruited or used for military purposes. Nobody. But under the age of 15, the laws of war are, it's such a grave crime that it's actually a war crime to do this for kids under 15.
Now, Iranian officials say that many of these are support roles. In your opinion, though, does that meaningfully reduce the legal or moral concerns?
No, it does not reduce the legal or moral concerns to say that a 12-year-old can be at a checkpoint providing support. I mean, that child is going to be just as at risk of death or severe injury from an attack as somebody who's doing something else at that checkpoint. A child providing food or carrying items or participating in forming vehicle convoys through the streets of Tehran, which are some of the other activities listed on a recruitment poster and spoken about by an IRGC official. All of those things place kids right in proximity to military forces and military installations. And, there's just no way a child can meaningfully consent to the grievous injury that might befall them for taking part in this sort of thing. That's why officials should cancel it immediately.
Mm-hmm. Just give us a sense of what the situation is for the children that are being recruited. We're seeing ongoing U.S. and Israeli strikes on IRGC and besieged targets. So what risks do these children face by simply being present?
The United States and Israel have trumpeted their own tempo of attacks. They are very proud that they have carried out, well over 10,000 attacks. And many of those have hit IRGC and besiege checkpoints and other military installations. So these kids are at severe risk. The pressure that these children might be under, we've seen reports, we haven't verified yet, but we've seen reports of an 11-year-old boy, a fifth grader, who was killed at a besieged checkpoint because his father had taken him there because they were, according to this report, short on manpower. This is the kind of pressure that kids are going to come under, and that it just needs to be stopped.
Mm-hmm. Have you been able to document other cases of children being harmed in this context?
We haven't been able to verify those cases. We have seen, of course, and verified the massive U.S. attack on a school in Minab on February 28th that, killed scores of school children. So, even non-military civilian targets have been hit by airstrikes during this attack.
Mm-hmm. Iran is not the only country recruiting children for military operations. What does that do to the mind and, the psyche of a child being dragged into this kind of scenario?
Well, I mean, let's assume that the child is lucky enough to survive without physical injury or being killed, and has been recruited. One of the reasons that international law is so clear in its prohibition on any and all use of children in armed conflict, including any and all of these kids that the IRGC is trying to recruit, is because of the long-lasting psychological effects. It can take many, many decades to help a child reintegrate into society, to get over the trauma that they may have faced, and indeed, in some cases, perpetrated. It is a terrible thing to do to a child. They're out of school, they're learning to kill, they are learning, military activity, and not allowed to be a child.
And Iran, unfortunately, has a long history of mobilizing children in conflicts. What patterns are you seeing repeated here?
I mean, the most famous and terrifying example was from the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when, according to Iranian officials themselves, more than 500,000 children were enlisted and recruited to go to the front lines, and tens of thousands were killed, in some cases doing mine clearance with, no protective equipment, nothing whatsoever. We've seen a pattern since then, unfortunately, of continued use of children, particularly in the Basij paramilitary group. So, this is not something that came out of nowhere. As I noted before, we have seen some reports that children were being used at checkpoints even before this latest recruitment drive. So, this is a longstanding problem.
The IRGC says that children have been asking to join their ranks. But how voluntary is this really? What kind of pressure or, environment and just, peer pressure or pressure from their parents within society, what kind of pressure are they under?
Yeah, well, I think two things here. First, if you are an Iranian official who is involved in recruiting 12 or 13 or 14-year-olds, and you go before a court for war crimes and say, oh, well, the kids asked me to let them participate, you are not going to be found innocent on the basis of that defense. And the reason for that is that children are, of course, very susceptible to, all sorts of messaging that they may be getting, not only from the state, but from their families, from other members of paramilitary or military organizations, and there could be incentives involved, as we've seen in previous cases. So, the point is that kids are not in a position, precisely because they're kids, to be making informed decisions about this. They're susceptible to pressure.
Mm-hmm. Are you aware of, coercive instruments being used, these children being pressured under threat to join the Basij or the IRGC? Is that something that you've been able to document?
We haven't been able to document too much on the ground recently. There's, due to the internet blackout and just the danger that people would face if they spoke, openly or by phone with a human rights organization. So unfortunately, we don't have much more detail on that right now. But, whether or not there's active coercion of children to join these units, the point is that as a child, a 12 to 13 or 14-year-old child shouldn't be getting invited and encouraged to sign up, and using them is indeed a war crime.
Absolutely. What concrete steps would you say the international community can take to stop this? Are there realistic accountability mechanisms?
Well, the most important thing right now is to stop this. And, it's difficult to call on, the United States, for example, to pressure Iran to do anything in the middle of an armed conflict. But not every country, obviously, agrees with or is participating in the attacks on Iran. Any government that has the ear of Iranian officials should be using every meeting, should raise it on the agenda at all times that, this child recruitment is a disaster. It is a potential crime, and it needs to be stopped.
Mm-hmm. That was Bill Van Esveld of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much.